So in lecture number 3, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the first permanent English colony, which is Jamestown. And admittedly, Jamestown gets a lot of press when you're looking at textbooks, things of that nature, because, again, it's permanent. And it also was the home of Pocahontas, subject of that Disney cartoon, amongst other movies. So it's definitely something that kind of has captured the public's imagination. So for our purposes, we'll begin by looking at how Jamestown got started. Now you see the word charter on screen. A charter is simply an official document that gives permission to do something. In this case, the VA Company, the Virginia Company was given permission to begin a colony in NA. When you see NA, in this case, it's short for North America. So 2 years before this, the English had signed a peace treaty with Spain, and keep in mind that they had been at war for some time. That kind of explains why the governor's supply run back to Roanoke was delayed, because it wasn't exactly safe to travel. So with peace at hand, England has time and capital to spend on colonization, and they were also able to hire sailors who had experience on the open ocean because they had been at war with the Spanish. So there wasn't necessarily a shortage of workers to man the ships, so to speak. And these people, this Virginia Company, is simply looking to plant a footprint in North America, and let's face it, they want gold. That's their goal. So we see that 3 ships left England, and about 4 months later, they arrived at their destination. Now, it definitely doesn't take 4 months to go from England to North America, but there were a couple of stopovers in the Caribbean, so that's why it took so long to arrive. And you can see that 40 didn't make it. Only 104 survived that journey, and 9 months after these ships landed, 38 were alive. That's it. Now, in searching for a good place to settle, the organizers actually decided upon an island that was a bit more upriver and not necessarily on the coast. The settlers called it the James River, but the locals called it the Powhatan River. Now, the charter itself, and you can see these 2 goals on screen. The charter has dual goals. The first is profit. They're inspired by all of these Spanish tales of finding gold in Central and South America, and they figure it must be in North America as well, because it's on the same side of the world. There was also the wording of propagating the Christian faith, and to propagate means to spread. Remember that Spain is Catholic and England is mainly Protestant, so there still is that religious component of trying to spread what they consider to be the correct form of Christianity. So technically speaking, the economic and religious motivations did work side by side, but most kind of acknowledge the fact that including this phrase, propagate the Christian religion, that was more to appease those who had religious rationale. Most of them wanted that sweet gold. Now remember, they weren't exactly on the open ocean, they were a bit more inland. And the possible threat of a Spanish invasion kind of led them to choose this location, which was swampy, it was forest covered, and it was just disease-ridden. And there were less than 24 buildings at its peak. Now, the location was good to defend against any possible Spanish attack, but because it lay by a swamp, it was swarmed with mosquitoes that carried deadly diseases in the summertime. Now, the wells were very shallow, and they were filled with salt water in the summer, which led to salt poisoning, and the rivers themselves ended up being filled with garbage and excrement. So dysentery and typhoid fever were pretty rampant in the summer and the fall. Now, if the colonists didn't exactly die from these diseases outright, they simply were going to be left very weak and apathetic. And if they're weak and apathetic, meaning they don't really care one way or the other what happens, they're just not going to cultivate enough corn to get them through the winter and the spring. So that kind of explains somewhat of the setup. Now, in terms of where they were located, we have an idea of what those conditions were like. But in terms of the people themselves. You know, the actual settlers, and we're not talking about the sailors that were employed by the company. The settlers were essentially one of two groups. The first are what we call gentlemen. You know, the well-off in society, the well-to-do individuals. They refuse to work because they never had to. They're not used to doing things with their hands, so they're not necessarily going to start now when they're just here for gold. You also have those who are poor and marginalized. They don't really have much experience with work either, because they're simply used to begging and stealing to survive, and these individuals are ones who were forcibly sent to Jamestown. So because these two dislike labor for their varied reasons, it leads to poor health or malnutrition. So enter Captain John Smith. Now, John Smith was part of the initial settlement, and he actually had been scheduled to be hanged prior to landing in North America, and obviously he was spared this fate. But when times get grim, in these early months, Captain Smith takes over. And he's Captain Smith for a reason. He has a pretty extensive military record, so he decides that he's going to run Jamestown like a military camp. And all colonists are going to be forced to work in the fields for 6 hours per day. Now, Smith does work out a deal where he barters or negotiates, trades for food with the nearby Powhatan Confederacy. Now, the Powhatan Confederacy are kind of a loose affiliations of tribes in this region, you know, kind of along what's now the east coast of the state of Virginia. And a lot of the colonists simply assumed that the Powhatan would help them out because they would view the English as superior, which that's not really necessarily the case. In the very earliest times, each kind of had something the other needed, so they were willing to make a trade. Now, 8 months after his arrival, John Smith, which you got the classic image of what he looks like here, John Smith was captured by Chief Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, in an ambush. The two people that Captain Smith were with were not so lucky. Captain Smith was taken alive, and he was kind of dragged to numerous locations until he finally met Chief Powhatan himself. Now, what happens next is somewhat the subject of controversy. Now, if you've ever seen Disney's Pocahontas, it famously ends with John Smith about to be executed, and Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, saves him, says she loves him, and there's peace between the two sides. The whole love story, doubtful. Really doubt that that actually happened. But it is widely believed that there was a mock execution that took place, as in Captain Smith was going to be executed by Chief Powhatan, but then his daughter Pocahontas stepped in to save him. And all of this was prearranged as part of a ritual whereby Smith and the English would then be considered what are called tributaries of the Powhatan, meaning the English would recognize the superiority of Chief Powhatan and his people. Smith didn't necessarily see it that way. He didn't think that this was ritual adoption. He simply tried to keep bullying the Powhatan into giving the English food. He kind of thought they were now on equal footing. That wasn't necessarily the case. So the struggle really continues in those early years. And Smith was sent back to England in October 1609 to get medical care following a gunpowder wound, but I mean, this guy ran Jamestown like a military camp, so he's not necessarily all that popular to begin with. What followed was a period known as the Starving Time. And it's no coincidence that the Starving Time follows his departure. Of the 500 settlers in Jamestown at the start of winter 1609, 60 were left by late spring 1610. That's 88% of the colony was gone. An initial resupply that had arrived kind of late found the devastation, and they were actually on their way back to England. They took the survivors, they were going to leave. But before they reached the Atlantic, 3 resupply ships with 150 fresh passengers arrived, and the colony was saved. Unfortunately, a year later, a new governor arrived, and he found that the colonists had kind of resumed their usual practice of neglecting the fields. So really within these first 4 or 5 years, it's not going well at all. So that begs the question, why on earth is this place permanent? Why is it a place we look at as lasting? The short answer is land. The Virginia Company allowed for land to be owned by the colonists instead of controlling the land themselves. And this differs from what the French will do in their colonies. You know, the French crown controls the land and the colonists work it. Here, no, you can own it. It's yours. And this is a huge incentive because land is really scarce back in England. Now, each settler is going to receive 50 acres of land, plus another 50 for each relative and servant that they paid for. So if you can afford passage for yourself, your spouse, and 2 children, boom, 200 acres of land, yours. Now, when we say servant, we're talking indentured servitude, meaning you sign a contract to work for a specified period of time. Most textbooks are going to say it's 4 to 7 years. They're going to get 7 years out of you. 7 years, basically hard labor. Usually, you know, the company will pay for your passage. Or maybe you're contracted to work for somebody else, but when your time is up, you get 50 acres of your own land. You're giving up 7 years of your life, but you get land on the other side of it. And because there's now private property, there's more incentive to work it and improve it. Now, if we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of why it really survived economically, the answer is tobacco. You know, John Rolfe was a businessman who actually smuggled in a special strand of tobacco that Spain had a monopoly on, and we're still not exactly certain how he got a hold of it, but he taught Virginia colonists how to cultivate a strand of this tobacco starting in about 1616. Took a couple years, but eventually it became very popular in England as well as mainland Europe, and King James famously denounced it, didn't want anything to do with it. Now, tobacco itself thrives in a long, hot, humid growing season, so that's why it gave colonial planters an advantage over planters back in England, an incentive to cultivate it. It leads to more immigration, leads to more people coming to what they're going to refer to as Virginia. But it also really destroys the soil, so more land is needed. These settlers are going to settle on indigenous land, you know, Powhatan land. And they're going to bring with them more cattle and pigs that are going to decimate these indigenous crops. Since, you know, the Powhatan don't really have any animals that are going to be eating their crops, so they don't have fences, and they also have different concepts of ownership of the land. So really these cattle and pigs are going to unfortunately destroy a lot of these crops. Now, tobacco's labor intensive, so more workers are needed. And in 1619, John Rolfe actually recorded in his journal that a Dutch ship had arrived in Jamestown with what he referred to as 20 or so odd Africans. Some of them might have been slaves. It's commonly believed most were indentured servants, and there were Africans in Jamestown prior to the arrival of this ship, but generally speaking, this is considered to be the symbolic beginning of chattel slavery in the U.S. Now, through all of this, the English and the Powhatan engaged in the first of 3 separate wars. You know, the first phase, 1609 to 1614. Pocahontas actually ended up as an English hostage, and the story is that Opechancanough and several warriors went to barter for her release, but Pocahontas didn't want to go back home, and she claimed that her father cared more about the return of stolen trade goods as opposed to her life. Now, I should say life. Getting ahead of myself here because businessman John Rolfe really takes a liking to Pocahontas and marries her. And this marriage was kind of seen as a truce that ended the war, and she was baptized as Rebecca Rolfe. Now, the Rolfes traveled to England in 1616 to more or less display Pocahontas, so to speak, draw up support for the colony. She ran into John Smith again. She unfortunately died the next year on her way back to Virginia. but it's believed this kind of gave some calm to the settlers at this time.